Any shooting in that animal will go right out from Billy.
Don't let him do it, Frank.
I done you enough, Brigade. Don't make me kill you.
Stop me.
Called The Spoilers, 1946. It's one of Randolph Scott's only out-and-out villains. And he's so much better than Wayne in that movie. I think that there was a grudge that was held there. But Budd never tired of saying, and so that's what we did. He said, we got Randolph Scott and we just shoved him right up John Wayne's keister.
Hi, I'm Rob Word. Welcome to A Word on Westerns. There are so many classic Westerns to talk about, but there's a group of them called the Ranown Westerns that Randolph Scott starred in, Harry Joe Brown produced, and Budd Boetticher directed. And the best ones were written by our old friend, Bert Kennedy. And there's a new book about one of those films that tells you about the whole history of all of those Ranown films and even more. It goes deep. And it's written by a 2-time Emmy winner, Kirk Ellis. Kirk is here now. Come on in, Kirk. Good to see you, pal. Look at these cowboy boots that he wore. Whoa.
Nothing if not iconoclastic.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, I can't see Randolph Scott wearing those, but they look good on you.
I think he wore these in his days with Cary Grant. So.
Well, those days, we're not here to talk about those days, though. We're here to talk about cowboys.
Yes.
Not only did you write this wonderful book, but you have a long history association with the director, Budd Boetticher. How did you meet him?
So when I was an undergraduate student in the early 80s, University of Southern California, I did the first comprehensive Budd Boetticher retrospective in the country. And I had to go down to, Budd at that time was long retired from film, as you know, and he had he was raising Portuguese and Andalusian horses down in San Diego County. So I'd seen Ride Lonesome, typically on the bottom half of a double bill in film school with Winchester 73.
That's a good double bill, though.
I'd never seen any of these films, and I was struck by how stark they were, how modern they looked, how very different from the sort of classical Westerns of John Ford they were. And it made me want to see all of the Westerns themselves and then ultimately all of Budd's work. So Budd, as you know, was a real character. He's one of the very few people in Hollywood who can literally be called outsize. Most people in Hollywood, when you meet them, they're always smaller than you think. Budd was much larger, and he was the kind of person who, when he was in a room, there was no oxygen left for anybody else. But
he liked it that way.
Oh yeah, but somehow I think my enthusiasm for his work and everything won him over, and he was able to provide introductions to a lot of his collaborators, including Randolph Scott. But there was also James Coburn, Alan Hale Jr., who was in one of his great noir films, The Killer Is Loose, and ultimately Bert Kennedy. And Bert became a real mentor to me as a writer. I've really learned, it took me years to figure this out, but I learned everything I know about film and about writing from Bert, and about what it means to be a filmmaker from Budd, because they were so uncompromising. Bert had this wonderful expression. He said, and I'll clean it up for the audience, he said, there's a fine line between indifference and not giving a damn. And I've crossed that line, and it was just always that sense of really independent thinking. So I do the retrospective with Budd, and it carries on for many, many years, and ultimately we become professional collaborators. As I try to set up, and the book talks about this a bit, try to set up his last film, a movie called A Horse for Mr. Barnum, which unfortunately never came off.
He wanted to make that for years and years, and I think you spent several years with him developing that, trying to raise funds through different iterations of it.
Yes.
And I'm sorry it never got made, but the ones that he did make, especially once he started working with Bert Kennedy,
Right.
on the John Wayne production 7 Men From Now.
Right.
How did that connection happen? Wasn't that originally a John Wayne story?
Yeah, so there's a story that Burt tells about that, which is that Burt, came from a theatrical family. He blamed Errol Flynn for him volunteering to serve in World War II. He went to see They Died With Their Boots On, the great Raoul Walsh film. And oddly enough, and I asked Burt to tell me this a couple times because it sounded like a joke, but it was true. So that's a film, obviously, where Errol Flynn plays George Armstrong Custer. Mm-hmm. So Burt does basic training at Fort Custer before he goes to the Pacific. And one of the things that Burt kept private, even to some of his closest colleagues, was the fact that he was one of the truly great war heroes of the 20th century. You go to, and I know there are people here who went to Burt's annual 70th birthday parties. Yes, some of the people here did, I'm sure, and it was great because you would see not only Hollywood royalty, and especially Western royalty, but there would be testimonial letters coming in from Washington, from Colin Powell, from John McCain. And Burt had wonderful Western memorabilia in his office, but just tucked away in a corner were a Purple Heart and a Silver Star. And I'd ask him about it, and he'd go, yeah, I was in the cavalry. Can you imagine this? I was in the first cavalry in the Pacific. And he would always tell a story that was, of course, embellished about how he was in the last cavalry charge in the Philippines. But that wasn't true. And the true story is even more incredible and even more moving. Burt was part of the advance guard for the liberation of the Santo Tomas prisoner of war camp outside Manila, which was the largest civilian prisoner of war camp in the whole Pacific theater. And his coolness under fire prevented a whole bunch of people from getting killed. And he was part of the patrol that led out the Japanese commandant and his men in front of a whole bunch of trigger-happy GIs, and it led to a peaceful surrender. And Burt never told that story. I had to dig that out. It was one of the things in the book. And the reason I tell this story is because the films that he wrote for Budd, starting with 7 Men From Now and ending with Comanche Station 4 years later in 1960, really changed the way the Western hero was looked at. There's no way that the films that came out of the late 60s and early 70s, the Peckinpah films like Little Big Man, they would never have been made had it not been for these films, which totally turned the conventions on their head. And it came out of the fact that Burt in the Pacific had seen a lot of death. And he was, as so many heroes that I've met, and I write the annual National Memorial Day concert for PBS. I've been doing that for the last 4 years, and so I see these veterans on a regular basis. Real heroes don't think of what they do as heroic. They just think of themselves as having performed a service. But Burt saw a lot of darkness that he brought back into these characters. So he comes back from the war. He's going to be an actor, but he then can't get hired as an actor. He thinks, well, wait a minute, if I write something, I can get hired, because actors always get fired, but a guy who writes like a script will always be working. At which point Burt realized he didn't actually know how to write a script. He starts in some forgettable radio shows, none of which take off, and his agent calls him up one day and says, look, Burt, I love you, but I can't even get you enough money to pay for the gas it takes you to get to these auditions for you to pitch stories. So the agent let him go, and the very next day, John Wayne hired him to work for Batjac Productions.
Based on what?
He had done an unproduced pilot for a show about a Mexican-American character living on the border who sort of falls into these comical situations. And Wayne as people sometimes don't know, he also had a stable of actors who he lent out to people. And one of them was this wonderful actor, now forgotten, named Pedro Gonzalez, okay, who had been in, I think, The High and the Mighty with him. And he really wanted something to do. He wanted something, I'm going to give this guy, this kid, you know, this show. Didn't come off, but he really liked Burt's writing. So he said, like, write a feature film. Let's see where it goes. So they gave Burt a corner office and a handful of pencils and a cup and said, go write something. And Burt had a title, 7 Men From Now. That was it.
Did he come up with the title, or did they say?
He had the title, and he didn't know exactly what he wanted to do with it. But what he does in that office over about 8 weeks, and Burt had a really regular writing schedule until his health really stopped him from doing it. He was writing every day for 5 or 6 hours. And he came up with this story of a man who you don't know what his history is. This was in a period where Westerns were set in a very concrete chronology. You could identify where they were taking place. The opening of 7 Men From Now is this rainy night. A guy rides up in a slicker. You don't even see him from the front. You only see him from the back. He goes in to this cave where 2 guys are having coffee. You suspect these 2 guys are maybe on the dark side of the law. He has coffee. He said, I didn't hear a horse. I wasn't riding one. What happened to him? Apaches. The Apaches shot him? No, they ate him. This is immediately Burt's, like, his sort of dark sense of humor coming across. And you realize that Randolph Scott is hunting these 2 guys. A member of his family was killed. He's hunting these 7 men. I said to boy, I said, how many of them you found? He goes, 2 of them. And then you cut, and there are gunshots in the cave, and then you get the credits for the film. And about 20 or 30 minutes into the movie, then, you meet the ostensible bad guy, which is one of the greatest roles Lee Marvin ever did. Mm-hmm. He's very flamboyant, wearing this green kerchief. He's got a prostitute's leg band around his arm. And what Burt and Budd do in these movies is there are no white hats and black hats. You can very easily see how the hero could become and may even prefer to be the bad guy. And through the course of these renowned films, and the ostensible villains are played by this amazing group of actors, Lee Marvin, Richard Boone, Pernell Roberts, and finally Claude Akins in Comanche Station, that you now have this sort of anti-hero. You can really trace the Randolph Scott character in these films, the renowned films, to Walter White in Breaking Bad. Mm-hmm. There's a direct through line. Those people who watch Breaking Bad probably don't remember this, and those who remember it don't know the reference, but the rival sort of crystal meth cooker for a couple of seasons is a guy named Boetticher. Mm. And that's no accident. Vince Gilligan loved the renowned films. And so these movies live on in different guises. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes them so modern. I grew up on Westerns. I'm from West Texas originally. Had to lose the accent because I went to high school in Colorado, which is mainly owned by Texans. So if you have an accent, you got beat up a lot. So,
well, the characters, the good bad guy and the bad good guy, in each of these films, they have dialogue exchanges between the 2 of them, and it's edgy. You think something's going to happen between these 2.
Right.
And in Ride Lonesome, it's a flip on that. It doesn't really take place.
That's correct. So there's always that trope in the classical Western where good triumphs over evil, etc. There's a shootout. That doesn't happen in Ride Lonesome. In Ride Lonesome, none of those confrontations occur. Now, Budd would always give a story out how originally Burt wrote the script and Pernell Roberts and his sidekick, played by James Coburn in his very first film, Coburn's all of 19 or 20 in that movie, how in Burt's original script, there was a shootout and they got killed. And Budd said, but they're going to love these guys. We've got to let these guys live. So and Budd never told a story differently. So it always sounded like the truth because he was like a good guy on the stand in a trial, in a prosecution. His story was absolutely consistent.
In his mind.
It is, yes, that's right. But Burt wrote Ride Lonesome to be one where the bad guys get away with the bounty, and the good guy, played by Randolph Scott, is left literally with just the embers and the ashes of his life.
Any shooting in that animal will go right out from Billy.
Don't let him do it, Frank.
I done you enough, Brigade. Don't make me kill you.
Stop me!
I mean, for those of you who haven't seen the film, this is a spoiler, but it's not going to stop me from describing the last shot. The last shot of Ride Lonesome is probably the greatest final shot in any movie of the 1950s in any genre, and probably in American cinema. It is a man standing in front of a tree that is consumed by fire, and this tree has a very female cruciform shape. And Budd was asked, he goes, so what happens on the next day for this character? And Budd said, we never really thought about what his next day would be. Do you think he has a next day in this? And that's what they do in all of these films. And it was interesting when I set about to write the book, I was saying, well, there's got to be other books that have dealt with this same terrain, but really the only analysis of these films that came up was Jim Kittis, a wonderful British film critic who wrote a book called Horizons West, which the original edition of was Anthony Mann, Budd Boetticher, and Sam Peckinpah. And that was really the transitional group of directors. But when I started going into this whole Ranown history, it was just fascinating. And then to walk, as you've done for so many years at Lone Pine, to walk that hallowed ground, and it really is when you love these
Very
movies,
emotional.
It's really incredible.
It's definitely up, but this is where Randolph Scott comes in the beginning. And then the camera comes over here and sitting right here. Oh.
Like weird leg.
Yeah, what is his leg? Oh, I gotta do like a weird. Yeah, something like
There you go.
like that, maybe?
There you go.
There we go.
Get that right hand on your gun.
How did Budd first come across Lone Pine? The first time he used it was 7 Men From Now, the first.
That was Harry Joe Brown. Harry Joe Brown, the producer, had used it years before. And Budd had been there once with a movie called Black Midnight. Small digression there in the, Budd was, he was a contract B director at Columbia Pictures. Made 10 films under the name Oscar Boetticher Jr.
One of the Boston Blackies.
That's right, exactly. His very first film, One Mysterious Night, about which the Hollywood Reporter said, literally, this film wasn't released, it escaped. And
He'll show them.
he goes off to do newsreels and documentaries for the Navy, has a hard time finding his footing again. So he ends up working at Monogram Pictures. Monogram, okay? The studios are now PBS here in LA, but he does 2 movies with a really sort of gawky, adolescent Roddy McDowall. And the good one is called Black Midnight, and Black Midnight, as you may know, is a horse. But the end of that film is shot in Lone Pine. And it's shot on locations that are very close to the ones that they end up doing the Ranown films on. And when you watch Black Midnight, it's like, it's just a location. It's just, Bud's not really attuned to it. He goes out to these films, and make no mistake, they loved going out there because there was no studio interference. Harry Cohn and his successors at Columbia weren't going to come out to the private airport in Lone Pine to check on him. Now, they then had to make these films for $250,000, $350,000 on, I think the longest shooting schedule was 18 days. Ride Lonesome was shot in 13 days. So there was a lot of creative independence. So Budd, and again, we talked about his being this outsized personality. There's a part of me that believes he says, Monument Valley, I can do better than that. And Lone Pine becomes his signature location. And those films just, because they're post-apocalyptic movies in a way. These are
The landscape is such a character in the film itself, and it reflects the personality.
There's nobody in it. It's scorched. I mean, he shoots, Ride Lonesome is the first film he does in CinemaScope, which Fritz Lang, of course, famously said was only good for shooting funerals and snakes.
The composition that he had in that film, too, is incredible.
He makes it all. He makes this widescreen look like the loneliest place on the planet. It looks like Mad Max. And I bring that up for a reason, because when you look at the later Mad Max films, particularly the last one, they're heavily influenced by the Ranown films visually. Very few people can make widescreen look confining, but Budd did.
Well, you mentioned Harry Joe Brown, who was Randolph Scott's partner.
Yeah.
His background goes back to the silent days.
Yeah.
But, talk a little bit about him, because most people aren't aware of his contributions.
Well, and that's part of the reason is due to Budd. Because Budd said, Harry Joe Brown got producer credit on those films, but
I really did it.
No, he had two jobs. He had to show up the first day to make sure everything was working, and then get on the plane back, or to get me a cup of coffee. But Harry Joe Brown really put that team together, and he was the one who encouraged them to go to Lone Pine. He had the expertise to get these films done in such a short window of time. It couldn't have happened without him. And it was funny, they're midway through the series. They've done 3 of the films. They're actually about to start Ride Lonesome. And of course, Harry Joe Brown, or rather Harry Cohn, the formidable studio chief at Columbia, dies, and a whole bunch of accountants and executives take over. And one of the first things they do is they fire Harry Joe Brown off his own productions. And Burt and Budd got together and said, if Harry goes, we go. He stays on our pictures. And so the last 2 films, he was still the ostensible producer on those. But his career was vast. And he was a real jack of all trades. There was a reason he was good at what he did, because he did everything everybody else on the film did before they did it.
Well, and Randolph Scott, because in 1947, he never made anything but Westerns after that, and his character changed and got so much darker with these films too, that it lengthened his career, I think, for another 5 or 6 years.
It easily did. I mean, there's that story about when John Wayne brings Budd Boetticher and Bert Kennedy together, and he says, so who's going to be in this? Because I'm not going to do it. I'm doing The Searchers, and he's crazy enough. Ethan Edwards, I'm not doing another one of these guys hell-bent for revenge. So they come up with a couple of names for this. Robert Preston's name comes up. But it's Wayne who says, I know who we get. Randolph Scott. He's through.
Well, he'd done a couple films with Randolph Scott.
Well, the reason for that was they'd been in a film together called The Spoilers, 1946. It's one of Randolph Scott's only out-and-out villains. And he's so much better than Wayne in that movie. And I think that there was a grudge that was held there. But Budd never tired of saying, and so that's what we did. He said, we got Randolph Scott, and we just shoved him right up John Wayne's keister. and Scott knew these parts were good. He knew they would take him to an area he had not been before. And one of the unappreciated things about the Ranown films is these are all generational movies.
How do you mean?
Scott is always paired up against a younger actor, generally playing the villain. And a lot of these guys came out of the method. They came out of the actor studio, and he loved playing with these actors because they were different, and they made him look better, and he knew it. And he was so generous to his co-stars. He'd always been a gentleman. He was never a traditional movie star. You never find him on a set reading Variety or the Hollywood Reporter. It was always the Wall Street Journal, to make sure one of those oil wells had come in.
Didn't he want Jim Coburn to have a few more scenes?
Yeah. So what happens on Ride Lonesome is that he does a scene with Coburn and Pernell Roberts, and Budd and Burt and Scott go out to the steakhouse one night in Lone Pine. He goes, "Tell me something, Bud. Who's that young fella in the red BVDs I was playing a scene with today?" And he says, "Well, that's a young actor by the name of James Coburn. It's his first film." He goes, "I like him a lot. You should give him some more lyrics." And so Budd and Burt go back to the hotel that night, and they write what is kind of the hands-down audience-pleasing scene in Ride Lonesome, where they're talking about how they're going to kill Randolph Scott, but it turns into, like, after we take his money, what we're going to do on the ranch. And these two guys who have been writing together for years, and you find out how little they know of each other.
Mm-hmm.
She's the kind that's got a need. Deep, lonely need that only a man can get at.
Now, how do you know?
I've seen in her eyes, Rick. In her eyes.
It's not in any of the scripts. It literally was done as an improv that day of shooting.
It sure is strong. And all those movies are strong too. And all of this is in this wonderful book, Ride Lonesome, that I see people waving some copies. Did you get them autographed? Okay, excellent. It's a fabulous book. And Kirk, I could listen to you all day long.
Let me just say one thing. So when you and I spoke at Lone Pine, we talked about Bert Kennedy's last screenplay. Because when I was working with Budd trying to sell Where's Mr. Burnham, Burt was also working to do another sort of large-scale Western. So I was always under the impression that it was unfinished. When I went back in October, I found that I had the completed screenplay. Burt had finished it. And it's called The Ladies from Lonesome. Okay. Ladies from Lonesome, and it's about a group of, shall we say, soiled doves who lead a cattle drive so they can go straight and start their lives over. And this is the script I was suggesting we do as a reading.
In March, okay? The Soiled Doves.
It's never been
And
done
there's
before.
one sitting in the front row, right?
Yeah.
That really sounds fun.
Boxlinder, there's a part, Jim Beaver. I'll tell you what your part is. Okay?
Good thing you showed up today, Jim.
Yeah. There's a character named Jake in here who's a chef, and it says, "Think of Jack Elam." So you need to be here in March. Yeah.
A big hand for
Thank you, guys.
Kirk.
Thank you.
We will see you back again in March.
Absolutely. Thanks to you. Thanks to you.